Ja, god dag, kjære seere. Vi ønsker dere velkommen tilbake til oss i Frikanalen, Trond Alis kvarter. I dag vil programmet vårt være på engelsk. Vi er heldige, har med oss i den samtale Ilan Pappe. Han er internasjonalt velkjent historiker, professor, skribent, forfatter. We welcome you to this program. Pappé, how are you?
I'm fine. Good to be on your program.
We are really glad to have you with us as our guest. You are a famous scholar, expert on Palestinian matters. So we have some questions to you and look forward to have your answers, Pappé.
Great.
First, I would like to announce that your book, which you have written some time ago, is a very, very book important indeed, The Ethnical Cleansing of Palestine. And I hope this will be read by many, many people. It is a basic book writing about the Palestine-Israeli conflict in my mind. So may I start to ask you, why did you write that book actually, and what, if you can tell us, what are you discussing in this important book, which I hope many people will buy and read it. It really is a most important book indeed in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I decided to write, first of all, on 1948 itself as a year, already when I was a student, first in Israel and then in Britain, because I was interested in history and I was interested in my own country's history, and I understood that 48 was a very important year. And I also realized that there are two different ways of looking at that year. I'm an Israeli Jew, so I knew quite well the narrative that, if you want, the Israeli Jews had on 48. I was less familiar when I was a student with the Palestinian version of events. And that's how I started to be professionally, first of all, and a bit emotionally interested in 48. But once I've decided to write about it as a scholar, I realized that it was more than just a year where there are two contradictory stories about it, but rather this was a very important year that the truth about it is not told. And I looked for evidence in the archives, in interviews with people who survived 48. And I wrote, even before I wrote that particular book, I wrote some other books on 48, but I didn't have a complete concept in my mind until I had a sense that I have a more comprehensive understanding between the connection between what happened in 1948 and the Zionist ideology and the Zionist project of colonization and the situation of the Palestinians in Palestine and the British position. And all that came into one big conclusion that one has, to my mind, tell the story of 1948 not as the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict or the first Arab-Israeli war, as many scholars like to call it, but rather as a year where a crime was committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. And I looked at a way to define that particular crime, and I thought that ethnic cleansing, which is both a legal, moral, and political term, describes very well what happened in Palestine between the beginning of 1948 to the end of that year. So that's why I thought that this was an important book to write, and I wrote it mainly for the public outside Palestine, because the Palestinians know what happened to them or to their parents and their grandparents. The Israelis were in denial, they still are in denial of what happened, but I thought that maybe the international community would be able to understand that many of its members are ignorant about what happened in Palestine, do not understand the full scope of the crime that was committed against the Palestinians, and that's why I thought that this book is really intended, first and foremost, to the public outside Palestine. Now, you asked me what the book is about in many ways. In a more focused way, I would say that the book describes the preparation, both the ideological and the strategic and military preparation by the Zionist movement since it arrived in Palestine in the late 19th century and until it started to commit the ethnic cleansing in the beginning of 1948. So the first part of the book tries to show how this was all planned until it became executed. The second part of the book tries to show what was destroyed in 1948. And it talks about 9 months in 1948 when half of Palestine's villages, 500, were totally demolished, how most of the Palestinian towns were emptied from their original population, almost 11 towns, and inevitably in such operations of ethnic cleansing, there were a lot of war crimes, including massacres. So this is also part of the second part of the book. And finally, the book tries to show what was built on the ruined villages, such as Jewish settlements, recreational forests, and how the world refused to recognize the crime and what are the implications of this denial that, to my mind, are the main obstacle for any genuine peace and reconciliation in Israel and Palestine.
You write in the book, around 1 million people, and that means Palestinians, were expelled from their homes at gunpoint, civilians were massacred, and hundreds of Palestinian villages deliberated destroyed. This is rather serious matter, isn't it, my brother?
It is very serious. It's, the beginning of the book, if I remember correctly, because I've written it in 2007, the beginning of the book, I say that usually in the 20th century, it's very difficult to hide crime in such a proportion, crimes against humanity. If you expel half of a country's population and destroy half of its villages, it's not something you can hide. But surprisingly, after the Second World War, this particular crime was totally wiped out from the consciousness and awareness of most people in the world. Not all of them. Of course, there were people who were aware, there were people who were struggling with the Palestinians and so on. And I think the situation today is much better. But when I wrote the book in 2006, 2007, I don't think there was one politician in the West, or even beyond the West, that knew what happened in 1948, understood the connection between what happened in 1948 and the reason why the Palestinians are struggling on the one hand and why the Israelis continue to oppress them on the other. You cannot understand why there is today in 2021, at the end of 2021, why there is still what people would call wrongly a conflict in Israel and Palestine if you don't go back to 48. Only if you know what happened in 48, you understand what's happening today.
You further write in your book that this ethnical cleansing, as you call it, it was from the start an integral part of a carefully planned strategy and lies at the root of today's ongoing conflict in the Middle East. If you please can explain for us what kind of carefully planned strategy are you thinking about?
Yeah. In order to understand it, you have to accept that the Zionist movement is what we would call today uh, a settler colonial movement. A settler colonial movement is different from colonial movements. Colonialist movement, classical colonialist movement, would send people of their home country or mother country to live in colonies that belong to the empire, like Britain and India, Belgium and Congo, and so on, and will go back to their homeland when the empires collapse. Settler colonialism is a different kind of human phenomenon. It's made mainly of Europeans who had to leave Europe, as many of the Jews felt they had to leave Europe because of anti-Semitism. But they are not the only ones who left Europe as settlers. Also, quite a lot of Christians were persecuted. And what is common to all these movements that began in the 17th century and culminated with Zionism in the late 19th century was that these Europeans that Europe didn't want were looking for a new Europe outside of Europe. They were looking for a new home. One can say that they were looking for a new homeland as well. The problem was that the places that they chose, like the choice that the Zionists made about Palestine, the places that they chose were already inhabited by another people, by the indigenous, the native people of those places. And as the late great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, says, the moment a settler movement, it doesn't only have to be the Zionist movement, it's true about the white people who came to South Africa, to North America, or to Australia. The moment that such a settler movement encounters the indigenous native people, in our case, the Palestinians, he said the logic of the elimination of the native is being enacted. In other words, if you want to create a new Europe outside of the Europe that doesn't want you, you have to remove the local population. So it's a project of what Edward Said used to call of displacement and replacement. You want to displace the local people and you want to replace them yourself. The uniqueness of the Zionist movement was the ideological cover that they gave, namely that they are not just coming to a foreign land, that they are returning to their own ancient homeland after 2,000 years of an exile, which we all know historically is not very valid, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that this was just a justification that was meant to encourage other Jews to come and encourage the Christian world to support the colonization of Palestine. The strategy I'm talking about, which is very typical to settler colonial movement, was to see in what means and under what circumstances can you have as much of the new land as possible with as few of its local native people as possible. And you can see from the moment the Zionist movement was able to buy land, to expel people, which began in the 1920s and culminated in the ethnic cleansing of 1948, they did it in order to create an exclusive Jewish space in what used to be Palestine. And because they did not complete the job in 1948, they continue to do it until today. And they are not succeeding because there is a Palestinian resistance movement. And Palestinians don't want to go, will not go. And as long as this ideology of removing them will be intact, what we call the conflict will continue.
You're talking about Zionism, the ideology behind this process. You are talking about Zionism. If you please can explain for us more deeply what actually is Zionism, Pappé?
Yeah. The ideology is Zionism. Well, Zionism started because of two quite, I would say, noble even impulses, which didn't harm anyone. One ambition of the early Zionists before they came to Palestine was to find a solution to anti-Semitism, which was growing in the mid 19th century and late 19th century. So they were looking for a safe place for Jews, and they felt, this particular group of people felt, and one should say that they had a point, that in Central in Eastern Europe, but in Europe maybe as a whole, Jews will never be safe. And we have to remember they are there before the Second World War, and therefore the Jews should look for another place. The other ambition that they had, they looked around them and they saw that quite a lot of religious groups began to define themselves as national groups. So the hope among Zionists was that if they would define Judaism as a separate nationality, let's say Jews live in Poland, and they would say to the Polish people, there are Poles and there are Jews, and the Jews are separate from the Poles because they are a different nation. Maybe the Polish government, maybe the Russian government would help them to find a place where they could be not just a nation, but build a nation state. The problem was that after quite a lot of internal debates until the very beginning of the 20th century, the decision of the movement was that the only place where you can be safe and the only place where you can build a nation state for this new idea of the Jews as a nation is Palestine. And the reason was, of course, the connection between Judaism through the Bible to Jerusalem, to the holy places for Judaism, and there are, of course, holy places for Islam and Christianity there as well. And I think what is usually not known that there was a strong Christian evangelical movement that pushed the Zionist movement when it was debating whether they should go to Palestine or elsewhere, that pushed them to choose only Palestine as the place for a safe haven and to rebuild a Jewish nation. The reason these evangelical Christians in Europe and in America pushed the Zionist movement not to give up on the idea of Palestine was that from their Christian perspective, the return of the Jews to Palestine would bring back the Messiah, resurrect the death, and so on. So in many ways, Zionism was both a Christian project and a Jewish project of the 19th century. It became a purely Jewish settler colonial project once the first colonies were built in Palestine in 1882. So that's what Zionism was historically. Today, Zionism is, I think, even worse in a way, because, as I say, you can understand some of the motivation behind Zionism in the 19th century. It was a different historical era. You could imagine certain things you cannot do today. Unfortunately, today, Zionism is an ideology of apartheid. And that's what's so bad about it. It's an ideology that justifies the discrimination against the Palestinians, the oppression against the Palestinians, only because they are Palestinians, only because of their identity. And this is a racist point of view. So Zionism, from an ideology that tried to deal with anti-Semitism, with the idea of the Jews as the chosen people in Christianity and so on, had transformed into a state ideology, which is not very different from the apartheid ideology of South Africa. At the time of apartheid, of course, not today.
If you talk of the roots of Zionism, some people say that there are involved some kind of racism in these roots of Zionism. And they refer to Theodor Herzl, who said, "We Jews, we are special people. We are not like other peoples. We need our own land, our own country, because we will never be able to live in peace with other people because of our speciality." Some people say, isn't this somehow also expressing some kind of a racism, stating that one people are separate from other people, they need separate solutions for their problems? Or what is your comment to this, please?
No, I think that's not the right way of looking at it. In fact, Herzl all his life wanted to be a German nationalist, but he was not allowed. I mean, most of the Jews who were Zionists became Zionists because they failed to be assimilated into the local societies, and the local societies refused to assimilate them because of anti-Semitism. We have to remember that. Unfortunately for the Palestinians, they paid the price for anti-Semitism in Europe rather than Europe paying the price for anti-Semitism. So no, I don't think this is something that at the roots of Zionism was very important. In fact, Herzl, if you read very carefully his diary, he thought that actually German Jews and Jews in Western Europe would not come to Palestine. He was quite sure that this was just a solution for the Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe. So, I mean, of course, in Judaism, as in other religions, there is a sense of a chosen people and so on, which is at the basis could be interpreted as a racist idea, but that depends on the faithful. You know, every religion can be interpreted either as a racist ideology or an ideology of peace. You can see it with Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. All religions can be weaponized either as a racist idea or exactly an anti-racist idea. So that was not the issue. No, I think the issue was that Zionism, the way it developed, had built an international coalition that was very supportive of the idea, partly because of anti-Semitism, in order to allow this settler colonial movement to take Palestine from the Palestinians with international backing and disregard for the aspirations of the Palestinians, their basic rights. And unfortunately, that coalition still today denies these rights to the Palestinians. And that's why I think so many decent people around the world support the Palestinian struggle, not because they are struggling against Jews. They support them because they are struggling against a colonial project that continues to the 21st century.
But is it possible to have a kind of Zionism without colonialism, so that Zionism could be a decent ideology promoting interests of Jews, or is Zionism rather very closely linked together with colonialism and expressing itself very easily as a way of a racist attitude, as we can see today in Palestine? Because I think we agree in Palestine today, the state of Israel, the result of Zionist thinking and the result of Zionist ideology, Israel, I think it's correct to say somehow it is a racist state, or what your comments, please?
Yes, it is a racist state. There's no doubt about it. And I said today Zionism is a racist ideology, and therefore I don't think there is now a Zionist option that is not racist. The only option in Palestine that is an alternative to an apartheid, colonialist, and racist regime is a totally democratic regime between all over Palestine, where everyone is equal, whether they are Jews, Muslim, or Christians, men or women. It doesn't matter. This is just a basic concept that Zionism cannot live with, the idea of equality, of total equality. In the case of Palestine, this would not be enough. You will have to rectify, to correct some of the terrible things that happened in the past. For example, I don't believe that there is a solution without the return of the refugees to Palestine and their descendants, and the dismantling of any institution that discriminates against the Palestinians because they are Palestinians. So I don't think that I'm that hooked about isms. I don't. If people call themselves Zionists and they believe that Palestine as a whole should be one democratic state where everyone is equal, and that the refugees can return, and they still call themselves Zionists, I have no problem with that. It's not the name which is important. Important is, what are your basic attitudes towards the situation in Palestine, towards the historical situation and the current situation. If you believe that the Jews have the right to have privileges that the Palestinians do not have, if you think that the Jews in Israel have the right to occupy parts of the West Bank and build a Bantustan in the other part of it, if you think that they have the right to impose an inhuman siege on the Gaza Strip. It discriminates against the Palestinian citizens of Israel and not allow the Palestinian refugees to return. If this is your Zionism, then yes, it equates to racism. If you are against all these things, as far as I'm concerned, you can call yourself a Danish person. I don't care. What I care is not the title, not the adjective. I am interested in the concrete human and moral positions of people towards injustice and the way to correct.
I think that if we have as a aim, and we should have as a aim, peace in Palestine, and if we agree more or less that the state of Israel today is a racist state, established like a racist state as a result of the Zionism ideology that was established, Israel is a racist state, and Zionism today seems not available to live without maintaining this racist element.
That's
Then
true.
it is likely to be against the state of Israel, against Zionism as an ideology. But if you maintain these positions, you are called today anti-Semite.
That's right.
How is this in your comments, please?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's today European governments signed all kinds of agreements, and several states in the United States adopted similar position, where any criticism on the ideology of Israel, any reference to Israel as an apartheid and racist state, is a position of anti-Semitism. This is a ridiculous allegation, by the way, and one we should fight against. We should not be intimidated by it, and we should make sure that people are willing to listen to what is the difference between A, Judaism and Zionism. And that's why I don't like when people say, yes, but Zionism is racism because Judaism is racism. That's ridiculous. There are many Christians who are racism and use Christianity as racism. The apartheid in South Africa was based on Christian theology. Not to mention what the Christians did to non-Christians around the world. We saw how the Islamic State is using Islam in order to impose racism. So I think we should make clear that Judaism and Zionism is not the same. And that's why so many Jews are anti-Zionists. And there are quite a lot of non-Jews who are Zionists. So this is very important. So that's the first point, to make sure a distinction between Judaism and Zionism. And therefore, a clear distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is racism. And there is anti-Semitism. There's no denial. There are anti-Semites in Europe, always were and always will be, probably. People who hate Jews just because they are Jews. However, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. It's an anti-racist position. You are against racism, whether Jews are imposing their racism, Christians or Muslims. In this respect, I think that we should be proud if we call ourselves anti-Zionists, because we are anti-colonialists, because we are anti-racists, and we should not be intimidated if people say exactly the opposite, that these are racist views. I think this is something we should be able to do if we know the distinctions that I mentioned before, if we have the patience to explain to people. And of course, people would try and stop us and silence us with these allegations. And unfortunately, the political elite in Europe, most of it is going along with this. I don't know why. They seem to be intelligent people. I don't understand how they're willing to do it, unless they are afraid of Israel, or they are being, they get something in return for that. I'm sure that if you ask them individually, they know this is a stupid allegation. And yes, this is something every one of us who would support the Palestinians should be ready, that you would be called an anti-Semite. But we're not alone. We should work together and not be afraid by such accusation. Any accusation that people accuse you and you know are not true is something that, in the end of the day, should not hurt you, should not stop you from continue your commitment to the Palestinian cause.
I think your comments are very, very important indeed concerning Judaism, Zionism, the state of Israel, racism. I agree with you fully. It's very important points. But at the same time, if we have as an aim peace in Palestine, and you state that in order to have peace in Palestine, the displaced Palestinian people, they have a right to return, actually. And this has to be stressed, that the people, Palestinians, also according to United Nations, have the right to return to their homeland. But if you start to stress these elements, and if you start to stress that Zionism will be opposing, I think they will be opposing the Palestinians returning to their land. So this is a crucial question, actually. Zionism will refuse the right of the Palestinians. There will be no peace in Palestine, as you say, without the return of the Palestinian people. So in focus for work, for justice in Palestine, you have to focus on Zionism as an ideology. You have to focus on the right of the Palestinians to return. Two very, very important points. But if you start to touch with these main elements in the conflict, then the enemy, if you allow us to talk about the enemy, they will start this attack calling you anti-Semite. So you have some kind of a strategy, or what is your comment? You have to stress the ideology of Zionism. You have to stress the rights of the Palestinian people. Then you are touching with the basic elements, and you will be accused of being an anti-Semite. So again, if you give us advice how to take part in this struggle, which in the end is the end aim at justice in Palestine, peace in Palestine, the return of the Palestinian people, how to maintain this struggle and be on the correct line, opposing Zionism, opposing anti-Semitism, opposing those which don't care about the Palestinian people's right, they are terrorists or whatever they are. I think we are in somehow an important struggle to settle all these elements. So please give us some advice, Pappé.
Well, I think not even me has to give advice. I think there is a great movement now among young people around the world, especially in the civil society, that begins to show us the way. And there are a few elements in this new strategy that, of course, will take time to mature. But I think we already in May 2021, we saw the beginning of this new strategy. One element of the strategy is not to separate the struggle in Palestine from other struggles. Racism does not exist only in Israel. It exists still in America, in Europe. And I think there's a new element of solidarity between people like the African Americans who fight against racism and the Palestinians who fight against racism, and other people around Europe who fight against racism. I think this is something that Israel doesn't know how to deal with. It's very easy for Israel to say, oh, you're just focusing on Palestine, as if this is the only place where racism is, this is the only place of colonialism. But there's a new strategy. They say to Israel, no, you are not the only one. There are other places where people are suffering from racism, apartheid, discrimination, and all these people fighting for justice in their own places, but also in Palestine. So because you are part, we who fight against racism and Zionism are part of a much larger international movement that fights against racism and discrimination and continued decolonization. This is a very powerful movement, which I think eventually would give the Palestinians a strength to counter the coalition that presently is against them. So I think that's one thing to pay attention to, and it's happening. We see particularly new connections, what some people call intersections. The second point is the Palestinian society is very young. Half of the Palestinians all around the world and in Palestine are half of them are under 18, and the younger generation is not affiliated strongly to the Fatah, the Hamas. They're not factionalized. They're not fragmented anymore. We saw it in May 2021, and I think this new unity among the younger Palestinians is something that would enable to hear a clear, united voice from Palestine, which is very missing now. You cannot build a good solidarity movement around a liberation movement if the liberation movement itself doesn't know exactly what it wants or doesn't say clearly what it wants. And I think this is going to happen, hopefully not too in the long future. And the last thing, which already has begun, it's very clear that a lot of people in civil societies around the world understand what we were talking about. And because of that, they will support a movement like the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. Of course, the governments refuse to accept it yet. But I remember the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. It took 21 years before the first government joined in such pressure after 20 years of action within the civil society to demand from the government to boycott and sanction South Africa. So there is a willingness in the civil society around the world to pressure Israel through the same means that the apartheid regime in South Africa was pressured. Governments are still refusing to do it. But I think we see the beginning of a younger generation of politicians who are talking in this language, and maybe this is a process that would, inshallah, continue.
May I ask you, if you turn again to the opinion, the way of thinking in the state of Israel, how far they have reached in this process of understanding the basic problems, to understand the position of the Palestinian people, to understand the historic events which you have written about in your eminent book, Ethnical Cleansing of Palestine, because I think people have to understand these elements which you are stressing if we are going to proceed on this process towards peace which you are stressing. So the question will be how this process stands in the state of Israel itself, among the Israelis, the Jews in the state of Israel. Are they rather fixed in their old positions, or are there movements starting to change positions even among the Israelis, the Jews in the state of Israel, would you say?
Well, no, unfortunately, most of the Israeli Jews do not understand this, do not want to understand it, and at this moment in time will not accept these ideas. There is a small group, also among young Israeli Jews, who are willing to accept it, and this group is growing all the time, but to be fair, it's a very small group, and we cannot expect in the near future any change from within the Israeli society. But this is what happened with settler colonial regimes like South Africa. The change does not come from within if there is no pressure from the outside and there is no unity of the liberation movement in the inside. And I think this is something that will grow once all the other elements I was talking about would be in place. I'm sure a lot of white people in South Africa were still racist on the day that apartheid fell. And nobody waited until the vast majority of whites in South Africa would say, oh, we're not racist anymore, and only then we can have South Africa without an apartheid. You don't wait for a large number of Israeli Jews to change. You create a situation, if you can, whether it would be much better not to continue with the racist regime than to continue with it. I'm not saying it's easy. I don't know if I will live to see it, but I think this is our aim. This is our aim. In the meantime, we don't give hope. of working with Israeli Jews who are willing to listen to us, to teach them their history, their correct history, explain to them the racist nature of Zionism, and there are some successes compared to what happened, let's say, 50 years ago. But this is a very slow process. And the more the other processes I talked about would succeed, I think this process would also increase. But for the time being, we have to do it from the outside. There is no hope in the near future for a change from within.
You say that we need to work also from outside. And you started to say also that in Europe still the knowledge about the basic problems in this conflict is not very, very clear to people. It is a process, will take time. And I think this also is a situation in our country here in Norway. There are quite many people, Norwegian people, who still don't have this knowledge what are the basic problems in this Palestine-Israeli conflict. So I think your points here are very, very important. We thank you, Ilan Pappe. But if I ask you...
Thank you very much, Tobias.
Just one more question. If I ask you with a few words to tell people in Norway what are the basic problems in this conflict, what need to be done, please.
Yes. As I say, I think it's very important to understand the whole idea of settler colonialism. I think that's the issue. The issue is that you have a movement that began as a colonialist movement, and although we are in the 21st century, this colonialism continues. And until you decolonize the mind of people and the situation on the ground, there will not be peace and genuine reconciliation. You have to understand what happened in 48. You have to understand the connection between what happened in 1948 and goes on today in Sheikh Jarrah or in Gaza. You have to understand that this is not a moral situation. This is not a just situation. And as we fight against racism and oppression in other parts of the world, we should never forget Palestine as one of the most important places that needs our support and solidarity in order to liberate the place and the people from racism and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ilan Pappe. We will look forward to your future works. We hope you will write more books. I'm very impressed by these books, which is important for me. So we hope to have you with us on a later occasion also. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
thank
Trond.
you to our listeners. Takk til alle sammen som har fulgt oss her. Vi synes dette har vært viktig. Vi håper dere har samme inntrykket. Og så ønsker vi tilbake igjen til velkommen, Frikanalen, Trond Alis kvarter.